Welcome back to this channel. I'm so glad you're here and joining us on this coaching through losses section of the channel. I'm assuming you have a loss you're dealing with, or maybe you're just curious about this section. But either way, if you find it helpful, great. If you want to pass it on to someone else, that's great. And don't forget, if you want to provide comments or give some kind of input, a like on the screen, let me know if it's something that's working for you or someone else. That's always helpful. But in the meantime, let's get started. Session 1, we talked about just an introduction of the difference between coaching and counseling. Coaching is taking you from loss to loss adjustment, coaching you through it, different than therapy or counseling. Session 2, we talked about losses. That was the last one we did. Say, well, how can we come up with material on that? Well, we could have gone on forever. We realized there's so many losses we go through. And that was part of your homework, really, was to come up with a loss that you'd like to work on for these sessions. We also talked about how there's a difference between primary and secondary losses, right? And how so many times the losses, the sting that comes and follows us through life is from a secondary loss that we didn't grieve. If you remember that from session 2. Today we're going to talk about what happens after the losses. Grief. Or should I clarify that? The grieving process. We all do it. And then you may say, no, that's wrong. I didn't really grieve. Well, you did. There's a chance you grieved, and you grieved probably in an unhealthy way. Avoidance, maybe. Substance abuse, workaholic, something. Who knows? But we grieve. A loss is painful. It's painful to us, whatever it is. Now, there's little losses, depending how meaningful the loss is to us, the bigger the sting is. That's why the loss of the death of a loved one is the biggie, right? But so many other ones are too. Relationships and breakups and divorce and job losses. Losses of dreams. You know what I'm talking about. Well, the grief process happens at the time of loss. And what happens is there's some stuff we go through. And I'm going to share some things from a researcher that you've probably heard of before, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Now, years and years, we're talking 1960, she did a major research project that talked about these losses. And the research project was actually about grief and death, is what it was, just the whole process. I don't want to get into that. But the bottom line is she came up with these stages of grief. Let me share them with you. Stages that she came up with was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Have you heard of those before? You probably have. They've been around a while. Well, later on, they were modified to say shock, then denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and then acceptance. So what I'm going to do right now is share, kind of define these a little bit. I'm giving you the knowledge part of coaching, because it'll take the sting away from whatever you're going through, just knowing that, hey, I'm kind of going through something here. Let me share briefly, and I'll put it on the screen as well, so you don't have to take all the notes. I'm going to try to get that figured out. Shock is initial paralysis at hearing the bad news. I mean, I'm glad that's in there, because there's always, no matter, even if you're prepared for it. Again, as a chaplain, I've walked through with many people through their dying family members. And there's people that have been on hospice and just in that process of death for a long time. And even for them, when that person's gone, there's a shock. It's like, wow. It's an initial paralysis of hearing the bad news. Denial is trying to avoid the inevitable. We don't like to face pain. That makes sense. Who on earth likes to run to pain? I mean, that's a problem in itself. Anger is frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotion. the frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotion. Speaking of emotion, and it relates to this anger part too, because when I first saw this picture that I'm going to show you on the screen in a minute, it made total sense to me. It says this: grief, a ball of tangled emotion. Take a look at the screen. What do you think? A ball of tangled emotion. I relate to that, especially after we lost our daughter. It's like that little gap in between the strings is an emotion, and it's just tangled up, and it changes, and it's a web. If somebody asks you, how are you feeling? 1 second it could be something, and another second it could be something else. It's tangled. Part of the grieving process and part of coaching through it is to untangle that web, or those string, that ball of yarn or fishing line or whatever you want to call it. It's to untangle it, to loosen it up. And part of that process is what you're doing right now. Getting knowledge takes the sting out of some of that. It defines it. It gives you power over some of it. It doesn't change it. The emotion's still there, but it's not tight. Let's go back to the process. Anger, frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotion. If that's not getting loosened up and expressed, it's going to explode. There's going to be some anger. And often the anger is how we deal with anger. Some people it's rage, some people it's self-destruction. There's a lot of ways. That's where potentially you go into the counseling process, if needed. Bargaining is on the list. Bargaining is always confusing to people. I mean, I get it in a spiritual sense. I know people often will want to bargain with God, especially when they know their loved one's dying or there's been an accident or something, and let's make a deal kind of thing. But let me read what it says here. Seeking in vain for a way out. It's inevitable. The person's either gone, a relationship has lost, or whatever it is. Maybe you're grieving the loss of a test, an important test, an AP test, or a pre-med test or something, and you didn't pass it, and you're grieving that. I mean, there's so many things we grieve, and the bargaining is seeking in vain a way out. Well, if I just did this, maybe if I did this, and we kind of wrestle with that stuff, but it's in vain. Depression is on the list of a stage in grief, and that's defined like this: the final realization of the inevitable. What's the inevitable? Pain. Hurt. When we finally come to that realization, it takes the wind out of our sail. It's depressive. Testing is on the list. It's a new one. That's the modified version. It says seeking realistic solutions. Maybe we start using our logical brain and start kind of testing it out here. How we can walk through this. If I try this, if I go for a bike ride, maybe that'll help me. Of course, the next stage is acceptance. Finally, finding the way forward. One thing that happens when people hear about stages of grief, they often start thinking, it's like a stair step, or it's sequential. No, it's not. The goal is that you get to that place. They call it acceptance. I'm calling it a loss adjustment. And the next session, we're going to look at a different kind of model regarding grief stages. The one that I have found even more useful than this. In the meantime, look over those losses. Those stages, and identify Where are you at right now? Talk with someone about it. Share some of what you're learning. Listen, God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you for session 4. Bye-bye.